light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Hu. I seem to be in the habit of discussing sensitive subjects that people avoid talking about because of how passionately and diversely the responses seem to get, and how sometimes nasty arguments result. And yet I remain convinced that these things really do need to be discussed, but we need to be able to talk about them in a civil sort of manner, to remember to discuss the ideas and not attack the people, to figure out what supports a particular idea or conclusion, and not to label any idea or conclusion necessarily as good or bad, except as the context makes it so. Some people would complain that this makes everything relative and no absolutes, and on one hand, I'm not sure if that's a bad thing, but I think we need to be clear about our reasons for why we believe what we do. However unlikely it may be that there may be a set of circumstances in which we would come to a different conclusion, rather than simply saying, these are my conclusions, I've made up my mind, don't confuse me with the facts, and not noticing when the particular conclusions are somehow not the best responses. I guess reflecting on my own life experience, when I was at the beginning of my master's program for my master's degree in theological studies, I found myself in a classroom where the professor wanted a discussion on racism. And he had this very kind of standard, canned, very peculiar intellectual definition of what racism is. The more I looked at his definition, the more it really didn't make any sense, and it was very arbitrary, and it really didn't resolve anything. And so I spent a great deal of time thinking about what racism is, and what does it mean, and how do we know when it is and when it isn't, and how do we respond to it? From a certain perspective, racism is an intellectual construct that people in graduate schools obsess about infinitely to no real resolution. And on a sociological level, racism is real in the sense that it explains to a limited degree why all sorts of acts of violence have happened. The reason I say to a limited degree is because there's always other details that factor into that without those other details, it wouldn't have turned out the way it did. So it's saying racism is a phenomenon all by itself is really not a true statement. It's a convergence of a lot of different perceptions and biases and value judgments and all sorts of things, histories. I very naively and innocently made the comment that the broad generalizations people were saying about racism and about racial classifications, I very naively made the statement that not all white people are the same, nor is any group, are the individuals within any group all the same, no matter which category you want to talk about. All the people who attend a particular church are not the same. All the people of any particular race are not the same. All the people who speak a particular language are not all the same. We all have individual quirks and everything, which is where I came to the realization that that there is no individual who is the embodiment of a category. In the intellectual discussions, racism orients around the categories in nearly every example. The only way you could really bring a specificity and a concreteness to it is to say, okay, how much does this individual exemplify this category? And of course you'd have to say, so give me the definition of the category and I'll tell you where the individual has all those qualities. I asked somebody when I was in graduate school after that horrendous experience, I said not all white people the same, and there were 3 people in the classroom who literally tried to have me thrown out of school for making that statement because they considered that a horribly racist thing to say. And I was just kind of like, what in the world are you talking about? There's nothing racist about saying that not all white people are the same. It's just a statement. It's an observation. any category you want to name. Not all people are the same. In my experience of graduate school, the categories were the only reality. There was no acknowledgement of individuality whatsoever, and nothing that the context within my graduate school experience could discuss without referring exclusively to categories, which to me would always be confusing because categories depend upon vague generalizations. There is no individual who's the embodiment of the category. I asked somebody at one point after that horrendous experience, so what is a white person anyway? And the person gave me this long description of all the different qualities and characteristics and dynamics, and they got to the end of it, and I said, okay, none of that has been part of my life experience. So clearly, according to your definition, I'm not a white person. So what am I? And no one was ever able to answer that question, which is where I come back to saying no individual is the embodiment of a category. There are people who, if you press them for a definition of the category of black people, would give you a list of qualities. Not every black person has those. The same could be said about every other categorization you want to name. But whatever description we come up with, it's always, it's a set of qualities that are generally associated with that term, but to act on them, we have to accept and understand that our actions go toward individuals. And if we're throwing an action toward a group, we're going to have to accept responsibility for the ways in which our action is not appropriate for some of the people in that group. That as many times as our action may be kind of sort of right, maybe a little bit, there will be numerous examples where our action is absolutely wrong. Because on an interactive level, it comes down to saying an individual is real. A category is nothing but an intellectual construct. A generalization is something we use for the sake of conversation. It doesn't tell you who the person really is, what they really need, what their experience really has been. There are points of their experience that they may have in common with the category, but there are just as many or more points of experience that are completely different from their category. I have one black friend who lives in Texas who told me not to come visit because he was quite certain I would not be able to deal with the practices of racism in his town. The ways that things were generalized, he was quite certain I would get myself into so much trouble because I wouldn't be able to respond in the way people expected. He was accustomed to it, didn't really think of it as a major thing because to him it was just normal. But it was amusing when he said that he doesn't define himself as an African American because he's never been to Africa. He knows nothing about it. He's just simply an American and describes himself as being black. And often in terms of these intellectual discussions, we get into the compare and contrast sort of thing where someone wants to say, well, I'm a person of color. Well, then, does that mean that someone else is a colorless person? We all have color of some sort, but it's the evolution and the problems of the limitations of language that in some cases we're using terms or terms were used as an interactional handle, if you will, but they really aren't accurate in terms of revealing what it is they're referring to or telling the truth of the thing to which they refer. Stepping to a more neutral example, one could refer to a chair as being solid, but if a chair is woven with straps, it's not actually solid. It's just a frame with certain strips that go across it, but it's not a solid object, like a board would be. But we use terms to refer to things because we want to convey understanding, not because we're trying to tell you the truth of whichever object, of that chair or of that person, or, is my friend in Texas black? Well, if black is the color you see on a chalkboard, no, he's not that color. But I've heard a lot of people described as white who bear no resemblance to the piece of white paper I have in my computer printer, or that I might write a letter, with, or something like that. They're terms we use. They're ways that language has evolved. But as I kept wrestling with this issue of racism, and what is it really, and what does it do, and why is it wrong, and why do people base the most horrendous actions at times on certain perceptions of difference, when the difference itself really doesn't mean anything? It's a difference, it's a quality, it's a description, but to relate to a person, you have to have a combination of so many qualities and characteristics and memories and linguistic practices, that to relate effectively with a person, to pass understanding from one person to another, you have to integrate it all. Not assimilate it in the sense of ignoring all the individual qualities, but integrate it in the sense of allowing each individual to retain everything that makes him or her unique, and yet to be part of the group. Not assimilated in the sense that you are now expected to behave like everybody else, whatever that is, but integrated in the sense that you are to come here with all of your unique creativity and perspective and help us see the challenge in a more complete way, and to see the possibilities for responding to the challenge in a broader way. If we had a particular, there's a favorite, I would tell you, I have a favorite television commercial by this manufacturer of a particular food item, where they were trying to advertise the fact that they had a range of different products. Each one had been flavored according to different ethnicities, and one had a Southwestern flavor, and one had an Asian flavor, and one had, whatever European flavor, an Italian flavor, a French flavor, all the different things that people around the world in general sorts of ways do with spices and with certain ingredients. One particular ethnic flavor may have more garlic in it in general. One particular ethnic flavor may have more tomato in it. And so to dramatize all this, the commercial has people of every nation virtually, or of all these different ethnicities, coming. This woman sets out this huge long banquet table that is just hundreds of feet long, with chairs up and down both sides. And then she rings a dinner bell. And suddenly it's as if people all over the world heard the dinner bell, and they all start coming, each with their own unique cuisine, and bringing it all to the table. And then you have people from all over the world, this amazing diversity of appearances and ethnic costumes and skin tones and everything else, all sitting down at this big table to dine together, and each one passing items up and down the table and pointing out different sorts of things. Oh, you should try this. Oh, you should try that. And well, try a little of mine. Here's what I brought. It's such a sharing, such as sharing of diversity, and yet the thing that makes it so fascinating is the diversity that they each bring to it, and that they're not getting angry with each other about whose is better or worse. They're just all different. And so many different ways that food can taste, and so many different ways that food can be prepared. And that applies to so many things in life. If we wanted to discuss clothing, different people around the world have designed different kinds of clothing to deal with different sorts of circumstances, to deal with extreme heat, to deal with extreme cold, to deal with wet climates and dry climates. By learning from each other, each of us can have clothing within our respective closets in our bedrooms that will allow us to deal with any kind of weather that comes along. We will be so prepared to deal with adversity because of what we have learned from each other that we never would have learned all on our own. The essential problem of racism then, as I tried to boil the definition down to its minimum part, is that it blinds one to the individual. That in racism, we look at a person and we see the category. We don't see the person. We don't see the individual person who is experiencing a need or experiencing a problem or a challenge or who wants something or who wants to communicate something. Instead of that, we see this projection, this smokescreen that we've created, that as if we expected them to be like a category, and they're not a category. So in a sense, racism is always a lie, a lie that superimposes a categorical list of qualities over an individual who bears only partial resemblance to that list of qualities, if any resemblance at all. Where the conversation needs to shift is to push the categorization aside and to begin to ask that individual, who are you? How do you practice your clothing, cuisine, belief choices, family relationships, whatever it may be? How do you as an individual deal with these things? Because if I can learn everything you know, and you can learn everything I know, each of us will be twice as prepared as before to deal with challenges of life. Because there may be situations in which my methods really haven't been as effective as I want them to be. But there may be something about your approach that I can integrate into mine that will allow me to deal with that challenge more effectively. So the central problem of racism is that it blinds you to the individual. You stop seeing a person. That was where in graduate school I had to keep telling people, don't look at me as a category of white people, because you'll never understand who I am or where I came from or what I've lived with. You have to look at me as an individual, as a combination of all these different things. And unfortunately in graduate school, I had not yet been diagnosed as autistic, so I couldn't put that on the table as well. And when I was finally diagnosed in my early 50s as having autism, the first thing, when I looked at the clinical psychologist who presented me with the conclusion of all this massive amount of testing we did, and I said, well, that explains a lot. And my mind just began racing back through 50 years of memories of all the different times I had been misunderstood, and how if anybody had said, oh, it's because you're autistic, everybody there would have immediately said, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. That explains it completely. Because you're autistic, you see details first and generalities second. So of course, when I said, give me a generality, you would have said, huh? I don't know what you're asking me. Or someone comes up to me and says, how are you? And I'm puzzled and I stall and I don't know how to interact socially, because in my mind I'm thinking, do you mean physically, psychologically, emotionally, socially, spiritually, professionally? What are you asking me? I think in details. If we had known that at the time, it would have clarified so much communication. But because we didn't know, we're stumbling around in the dark, misunderstanding each other over and over again. And over again, people attempting to place a categorical label on me that was completely unable to explain why I answered and acted and behaved the way I did. In a similar sort of way, when I would encounter other people who may have more in common with those qualities, I didn't know what to make of them, because the only frame of reference I had for interpreting life was my own experience. I grew up in a small farming community in southern Wisconsin. People who grew up in New York City were a total mystery to me. I had no way of understanding such things. People who grew up in Scandinavia or in Africa or in Asia, I wouldn't have a clue. I reach out with the best of my understanding, but the biggest part of understanding somebody who is completely different, instead of lapsing into racism, that, well, you're a whatever, and that means to instead say, you're an individual. Teach me who you are. Tell me what you've experienced. Tell me how you see things the way you do. Tell me how you define what is polite and what is rude. Because what's polite and what's rude varies enormously from country to country, and even within countries from area to area, and also within economic strata. Even within a country, you have poor people and rich people, and each different group of people within a country will consider certain things rude and certain things polite. And, you know, if I were to go to New York City, I could say right to someone's face, I don't like you, and they would shrug and say, you'll get over it. If I were to do that in my small hometown in southern Wisconsin, the person may be offended and not talk to me for 6 months, because there is not the same sort of directness to communication. If it is a requirement that one has to know all that before succeeding in that environment, however, it's going to be a disaster, because there is no way to know enough about these very peculiar environments. When you haven't grown up there, you haven't seen it for 10 years before you even, I mean, by the time you're 10, supposedly, in any area, you've kind of got a feeling, even if you can't put words to it, to how people think and interact. I'm not sure it always works, though, because on top of that, you have things like autism that insists upon a more literal interpretation of language, and in cultures where behavior is more nuanced, that you do it this way because that's the way mom and dad did it, and maybe you've never really even known why you did it that way, but because everybody does it that way and everybody expects to do it that way, as long as you do it that way, everybody's fine. But if you don't do it that way, everyone gets upset, but people really don't even know why. But from an autistic perspective, because I see the details first, I wanted to know why. And I didn't like the notion, I mean, didn't like isn't even really adequate, it's an understatement. I couldn't do things if I didn't know why, because they didn't make any sense, and I would be acting in a duplicitous manner. I would be acting out something I didn't believe. I would be playing along with something I didn't believe. I would be saying something I didn't believe. And the duplicity between what I understood to be truth on the inside and the truth I was expected to perform on the outside, the contrast would literally make my brain lock up. Somebody once told me that you have to be willing to lie on your resume, and then they suggested a hypothetical situation where I was to lie about what my experience had been or what I was bringing to a particular opportunity, and it's like my brain totally froze up, and I could not think of how to deal with the situation, because I couldn't force myself to say a lie, because it would create such an intense internal conflict of my brain trying to project a lie that it knew wasn't true. It was like I was acting against myself and attacking my own spirit in some sort of violent way, and I couldn't do it. And you know, that pretty much ended our conversation, and the person gave up trying to help me with dealing with employment issues. But in all of this, I guess what I keep coming back to is, whether it's racism or some other ism, these are conversational labels. They're not boxes that people live within. They're simply reference points on a map, something to give us a way of talking to each other. But we need to be very, very mindful that these are not appropriate expectations to have of people, because everyone you ever meet will be an individual with a unique history, a unique experience, a unique way of perceiving. And by being unique, there's something special about that. I've met gay people who want to blend in and be just like everyone else, and it's pointless. You can't. Nobody can be just like anything. A gay person will always have a gay person's perspective, and you can have a perspective that's more apologetic, that thinks there's something wrong with being openly gay and refuses to mention it. You can have a perspective that's very reticent, that hides from the world. Or you can have a perspective that's very open, that allows people in and allows for the development of friendships and collaborative relationships. If we never let people in, we won't have teammates. if we don't have teammates, there'll be a whole lot of situations we'll never be able to deal with effectively. As it's often been said, no man is an island. Each man's joys and sorrows and birth and death, the experience of life around us is an imperative of finding a way of truth and of understanding and of love to allow us to truly be family to each other. A final note I'll leave you with, when a wonderful, brilliant insight in an article written by a black woman when she was discussing racism and how do we erase racism. And she said the biggest obstacles she continues to run into are people who think everything is racism and people who think nothing is racism. Because every moment of life requires discernment to figure out who are the individuals in the midst of this and how much of this and how much of that is really present. And somehow in the midst of all that, it comes down to finding ways to love whichever individual is right in front of you. Thank you for watching.